The smell of sharp white pine and cold damp earth hung heavy in the 2 a.m. air, masking the metallic tang of the impending coastal rain. I wiped a streak of wood glue from my thumb using a shop rag, the rhythmic scrape of my chisel against the workbench the only sound breaking the absolute quiet of my property. The void of the late hour was familiar, a quiet space where the rest of the world stopped demanding things, leaving me alone with my tools and the measured reality of joinery. Then, a sharp, urgent knock rattled the glass of my front porch door, pulling the quiet apart. I stepped out of the workshop and crossed the yard to my house, the gravel crunching under my steel-toed boots. Through the screen door, bathed in the harsh yellow glow of my porch light, stood Madeline Gardner. I opened the door, stepping into the frame. She was wearing a thin white slip dress, a cream-colored cardigan falling off one shoulder, completely inadequate for the sharp drop in temperature. Behind her, visible across the dark expanse of our dividing fence, the massive, sagging silhouette of her late husband's barn stood against the night sky. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, shivering slightly as the wind whipped across the porch. "The main beam," she said, her voice a tight, thin wire of panic. "I heard it crack. It's going to come down." I didn't offer a platitude. I just nodded, turning back inside to grab my heavy canvas tool bag and my industrial mag light. "Show me," I said, stepping past her onto the porch, intentionally blocking the wind with my shoulders as she turned to lead the way. The grass was slick with dew as we crossed the property line, the looming shadow of the barn groaning under its own weight. Madeline's husband had been buried 3 days ago. I had watched the procession from my roof while repairing a shingle, keeping my distance. Now, stepping inside the cavernous space, the smell of rot and compromised timber hit me instantly. I clicked on the flashlight, sweeping the harsh white beam up to the loft. The central 6x12 load-bearing beam had a massive longitudinal shear fracture. It was bowing downward by at least 4 inches. "Vance, the county safety inspector, left a notice on my door this afternoon," Madeline said softly, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "He's coming back tomorrow at 8. He said if the structure isn't stabilized, he's condemning the property." I walked to the center of the dirt floor, my boots finding the exact point of maximum stress. The work her husband had done was sloppy, undersized joist hangers, improper load distribution. I didn't say it out loud. I just set my bag down with a heavy thud. "You need temporary shoring before morning," I said, pulling out my laser level. "If it drops another inch, the lateral forces will push the sidewalls out, and the roof comes down." Madeline let out a shaky exhale, pressing the heels of her hands to her eyes. "I don't have the money for a crew right now, Jackson. The accounts are tied up." "I didn't ask about your accounts," I replied bluntly, snapping the laser line across the dirt to find dead center. "Go stand by the door. You're in the collapse zone." I spent the next 3 hours working in aggressive silence. I dragged 4 8x8 pressure-treated posts from my own lumber stash across the yard. Using a 20-ton hydraulic bottle jack, I slowly, methodically applied upward pressure to the fractured beam. The wood groaned, a terrifying sound in the dark, but the laser line proved the deflection was correcting. I braced it with heavy steel gusset plates, driving 4-inch structural screws with my impact driver until the framework was rock solid. When I finally stepped back, my shirt was soaked in cold sweat, my shoulders burning from the overhead leverage. Madeline was still standing exactly where I told her to, watching me. The immediate danger was gone. "It'll hold," I said, wiping grease from my hands onto my jeans. "For now." She walked forward, looking at the massive temporary columns. Her shoulders dropped, a visible transfer of anxiety bleeding out into the dirt floor. "Thank you," she whispered. "Vance is a stickler," I told her, packing my tools. "He'll see this is temporary. You'll need a permanent retrofit." I walked her back to her porch. Before I turned to leave, I unclipped my heavy-lined canvas jacket and handed it to her, ignoring her surprise. "It's freezing. Go inside." I walked back to my house in just my t-shirt, the cold biting my skin, keeping my focus strictly on the gravel ahead. At 8 a.m., Vance arrived in a white county truck carrying a clipboard and an expression that assumed failure. I was already on Madeline's porch, drinking black coffee from a thermos, watching him walk up the driveway. Madeline stood beside me wearing jeans and an old sweater, her posture defensive. "Mrs. Gardner," Vance said, his voice carrying an irritating bureaucratic whine. "I assume the barn hasn't been touched. I have the condemnation paperwork right here." "Take a look inside first," I said, stepping off the porch to block his direct line of sight to her. Vance frowned, but walked to the barn. He took one look at the shoring I'd built, his eyes tracking the steel plates, the precise alignment of the posts, the sheer overkill of the load transfer. He clicked his pen, clearly annoyed that he couldn't find a flaw. "This is temporary," Vance stated, pointing his pen at me. "Section 4.1 of the county code requires a permanent structural load path correction." "I'm aware of the code, Vance," I said evenly. "The load is fully transferred to the foundation pad. It's safer right now than half the new builds in this county." "You have 14 days, Vance snapped, looking back at Madeline. 14 days for a permitted permanent fix, or the bank gets notified and the property is red tagged. After his truck kicked up dust leaving the driveway, Madeline leaned against the porch rail, closing her eyes. 14 days, she repeated. "It's impossible." "No, it isn't," I said, pouring the last of my coffee onto the grass. "I'll draft the plans tonight. You buy the materials. I'll do the labor." She opened her eyes, staring at me. "Jackson, I can't ask you to do that. You have your own custom business to run." "You didn't ask," I corrected her, picking up my thermos. "I'm telling you. We start tomorrow." I didn't wait for her to argue. I walked back to my shop, forcing myself not to look back at how small she looked, standing alone on that massive porch. The next week became a rhythm of sawdust, heavy lifting, and the quiet tension of proximity. I spent every afternoon at her barn, dismantling the damaged loft. Madeline didn't just watch, she insisted on helping. She hauled away the rotted timber, her hands blistering despite the gloves I handed her. On Tuesday, while she was inside taking a call from the probate lawyer, I noticed the bottom hinge on her back porch door was entirely sheared off, making it difficult for her to lock. I didn't mention it. I just walked over with my drill, swapped the hardware, and aligned the strike plate so it shut with a solid, effortless click. When she came out later, she pulled the door, stopped when it glided smoothly, and looked over at me, framing a wall 50 feet away. I kept my head down, driving another nail. By Thursday, the exhaustion was settling into my bones. We were sitting on a pile of lumber in the barn, eating sandwiches she had brought out. The afternoon light was fading, casting long, dusty shadows across the dirt floor. "He knew it was failing," Madeline said suddenly, staring at the old wood. Her voice was hollow. "My husband. He knew the roof was bad. He just ignored it." "He ignored a lot of things." I stopped chewing. I set my sandwich down on a clean piece of Tyvek wrap. I didn't offer a philosophical excuse for a dead man. "Ignoring a fractured header doesn't fix it," I said quietly. "It just drops the roof on whoever is left standing underneath." She looked at me, her eyes catching the dim light. "That's exactly what he did," she whispered. She pulled her knees to her chest, twisting the plain silver band still on her left hand. "The debt, the barn. He left me under it." I felt a sudden, sharp instinct to pull her against me, to physically shield her from the weight of her own life. Instead, my hands stayed firmly planted on my knees, my knuckles turning white. "You're not under it anymore," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "I'm bracing the walls." The shift happened on day 7. The sky bruised a dark, violent purple by mid-afternoon. The coastal storm wasn't supposed to hit until the weekend, but the wind was already tearing at the loose tarps covering the exposed roof section we hadn't sheathed yet. "Grab the staple gun!" I yelled over the roar of the wind, fighting to hold down a massive sheet of reinforced plastic. Madeline scrambled up the scaffolding beside me, her hair plastered to her face by the sudden, driving rain. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the heavy staple gun into the wood, securing the edge just as a massive gust threatened to rip me off the platform. We fought the storm for an hour, securing the envelope of the building. When we finally dropped down to the safety of the interior dirt floor, we were both soaked to the bone, gasping for air. The barn was dark, the wind howling against the newly secured walls. Madeline leaned against the workbench, shivering violently. I walked over to my tool bag, pulling out the clean, dry flannel shirt I always kept wrapped in plastic for emergencies. I stepped into her space, close enough to feel the cold radiating off her wet clothes. I didn't let my gaze drop. I draped the heavy flannel over her shoulders, pulling the collar tight around her neck. The sudden stillness in the barn wasn't from the wind dying down. It was the psychological silence of the sanctuary we had just built. She looked up at me, her hands gripping the edges of the flannel. The proximity was a heavy gravity, pulling all the oxygen from the room. I could see the exact moment she stopped being afraid of the storm and started looking for an anchor. I took one deliberate step back. "Go to the house," I said, my voice tight, forcing the distance because I knew if I stayed, I would cross a line that wasn't mine to cross yet. "Get warm." By day 12, the physical toll was absolute. I was running on 4 hours of sleep a night, my hands wrapped in athletic tape to cover the split skin. The permanent structural beams were in place, the massive mortise and tenon joints cut with absolute precision and pinned with oak pegs. Vance arrived unannounced on day 13. I was up on the ladder when he walked in. He didn't look at the flawless joinery. He looked at the stacks of rough-sawn oak sitting in the corner. "This lumber," Vance said loudly, his voice echoing, "it doesn't have an ALSC grade stamp on the face. I can't verify the structural integrity. I'm failing the inspection." Madeline, who had been sweeping the far corner, froze. "Mr. Vance, we paid a premium for that timber. It's solid oak." "Rules are rules, Mrs. Gardner," Vance sneered. "Without a grade stamp, it's decorative. I'll be posting the red tag." I climbed down the ladder slowly. I walked over to my metal clipboard, flipped it open, and pulled out a manila envelope. I didn't raise my voice. I walked straight to Vance and handed him a stack of papers. "Those are the mill certificates, directly from the sawmill," I stated clearly, the tone of my voice dropping the temperature in the room. Stating the exact density, moisture content, and structural grading of every beam in this building, verified by an independent engineer, which supersedes a face stamp under County Code Section 7.2. Vance stared at the paperwork, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked at the engineer's seal, then looked up at me. I simply stared back, a brick wall of unyielding fact. "Sign the permit, Vance," I said quietly. He scrawled his signature on the green tag and practically threw it on the workbench before marching out. The silence he left behind was profound. Madeline stared at the green tag on the table, then picked it up. Her hands were shaking. "You got the engineer's certificate before we even started," she realized. "I don't leave things to chance," I said, packing my tools. "The barn is yours, clean and clear." She walked over to the back corner of the barn, an area she had cleared out yesterday. She dragged an old, sturdy wooden table into the center of the space. She set a small lamp on it, plugging it into the newly run electrical outlet. She flipped it on. She was reclaiming the space, marking it as hers, separate from the ghost of her husband. I watched her from the doorway. My job was done. I slung my tool bag over my shoulder, the weight of it feeling heavier than usual. "I'll see you around, Madeline," I said, the words feeling inadequate. I walked back to my empty house. I took a shower, the hot water washing away 2 weeks of sawdust and tension, but leaving a hollow void in my chest that hadn't been there before she knocked on my door. I went to my kitchen, turned on the small light over the sink, and sat in the dark at the table. I left the porch light on. I didn't know why. I just left it on. At 3 a.m., I heard the crunch of gravel. I didn't wait for the knock. I opened the door. Madeline was standing there wearing jeans and my flannel shirt. She wasn't shivering. She looked calm, grounded, and entirely certain. She didn't say hello. She reached into her pocket and placed a heavy brass key on the railing between us. "That's the new lock on the barn," she said, her voice steady. "I set up a workshop space for you, in the back, if you want it." I looked at the key, then up at her face. "Madeline, you don't owe me workspace." "I'm not paying a debt, Jackson," she said, stepping forward, erasing the distance I had meticulously maintained for 2 weeks. "I'm making a choice." The restraint I had built like a retaining wall finally gave way. I reached out, my calloused hand wrapping gently around the back of her neck, my thumb resting against her jaw. The touch wasn't a spark. It was the heavy, undeniable thud of a ship's anchor hitting the ocean floor. She exhaled, leaning into my palm, her eyes closing as the tremor in her shoulders finally, completely stopped. I leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It was the final, absolute feeling of arriving home after a long, exhausting fight. The world outside the porch ceased to exist, blocked out by the quiet certainty of her standing right there, choosing to stay. I learned that true safety isn't found in ignoring the cracks in the foundation, but in finding someone willing to stand in the debris and help you rebuild. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.